Welcome to Tina Talks, where time is not a healer, but we believe that we all have the power to heal ourselves and take our mental well being into our own hands. This podcast is a byproduct of Tina, the mental well being marketplace, and a community platform at timeisnotahealer.com, providing you with the best products for you and your self healing journey. Hit subscribe and follow us on socials if you want support on your mental well being journey. We're your hosts. I'm Kelsey. This is Sophie. And this episode is all about therapy and how therapy can actually be really good for you and how we should be destigmatizing the topics around therapy and talking about it. So how are you doing today, Sophie?
I'm good. I've had a therapy session this week. No, I actually have. But personally, like my personal belief, like I've been going to therapy for like 6 years, more or less, on and off, not constantly. But my personal belief is that everyone should go to therapy at some point in their lives. I personally think it's a very helpful tool, and can really benefit like in so many different ways. It doesn't need to be that something's wrong to go to therapy. And I think it'll be interesting to have this conversation with you because obviously you're from the States, I'm from the UK. We've got probably very different viewpoints on what therapy looks like, or like how it's been perceived in our different societies, because in the UK it's not really that spoken about. Like it is becoming more, obviously, particularly with like apps like Better Health, for example, and there's another one we can talk about later in the UK that keeps popping up. But I know in the States that it's obviously a way bigger thing. Like most people have a therapist, right? Is that a thing?
No.
Oh, okay. That was my perception
No.
of like conversations that I've had.
Yeah, no. So, okay. I would say maybe we have, I think maybe there's been more open conversation around therapy, but I would say it's more of a generational thing, right? So millennials, like maybe depending on the type of millennial, were you born in the 80s versus like the later 90s? I'd say the later 90s babies, they're going to therapy. I mean, I'm 91 and I worked in the field. I've gone to therapy. I don't have a therapist right now, but I do therapy throughout my life. And then I would say the Gen Z and younger, therapy is like a now becoming a more prolific thing for the older millennials. And then is there a gap? There's a gap. Is it Gen something between boomers?
Yeah, I can't
Gen
remember what it's
X?
called.
I think it's
Maybe.
Gen X. Yeah, Gen X and then boomers. They're not so big on therapy. I'm not saying not everybody, like, I'm not trying to, really kind of create a population of people, but I do know the older generations are not as open to therapy. So yeah, I think it's more of a generational thing rather than a location thing, especially with like the openness of social media and the access that everyone has across, like from the US to Europe to Asia. It's a little bit different. It's opened up a lot of doors for people. But what I think what might be just just a good starting place for people who are not aware, there are different types of therapy and different things to think about. So I think when people who are not really familiar with the psych field, they think like, oh my God, I could potentially be locked up in the cuckoo's nest. Like, like the movie One Who Flew Over His Cuckoo's Nest, like all that stuff. They think Girl Interrupted, which if no one's seen that movie, fantastic movie, Angelina Jolie and a bunch of other really big names in there actually. But yeah, so there's different types of therapies, right? There's talk therapy where you go and you're just having conversations and talking. You can find therapists that specialize in certain practices. So it can be very heavily like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or a subsect of that is dialectical behavioral therapy, where you're actually doing exercises and practicing through certain things. And these practices can also be used in talk therapy, but they might be more subtle versus like actual working on a workbook kind of thing. And there's solution focused brief therapy, there's integrated family systems, there's all different kinds. And so you definitely have to have at least a little bit of an idea of what you're looking for. And if you don't, I mean, most therapists are certified in multiple different practices. You could just go for talk therapy. That would be seeing someone who is usually a social worker. That would be like their licensing, potentially a psychologist, but not a psychiatrist. A psychiatrist is someone that you're going to for more things on the neuro psych side, on the medical side, right? So if you're struggling and you're looking for medication, the psychiatrist might be able to provide medication and then talk to you and then provide recommendations for the best therapy for you to go to, because they do have training, but psychiatrists don't provide the actual therapy of like that kind of ongoing interaction. And then when it comes to, now this might be different in the UK, I don't know for you, but for clinical, like clinical help, thinking inpatient, there is not a lot of programs these days that are long-term residential programs where like you go into the hospital and then you're there for months on end. In the 80s, well, more so during the 70s, when there was 60s and 70s, when there was the civil rights movement, it was, rights for all. And a lot of people who were being thrown into psychiatric wards were just being like left the key thrown away. And then the conditions were horrible and they weren't being treated right as people with rights, that kind of thing. And so there was this big de-hospitalization of where they like basically stripped all of these programs, and then they released a bunch of people out onto the streets with no support, which is worse, right? Like they were housed and they had a place, but they weren't being treated right. But then they removed all these amenities. And this is why when you see in the US, we have a high population of homeless people who are in an older generation and who struggle with mental health, because they were part of that move, like that movement. It's now teetering off, it's less and less, but long-term programs don't really exist, and you have to jump through a lot of hoops to really get into long-term residential, and they're very, very expensive and oftentimes not covered by insurance. When it comes to short-term, it's more so meant to be if you are struggling severely to the point that you cannot take care of yourself, like you just aren't functioning, or you're an active harm to yourself or an active harm to other people, you can go into a clinical unit, a psychiatric unit. And that's where I used to work. I worked there for like 6 years. And that's where you go and you get stabilized. So sometimes, depending on the state you're in or the program that it is, you can get access to like some group therapy while they're trying to work on some meds to help stabilize your mood or whatever it is that you have going on, to make sure, you're getting hydrated, you're getting food, and like just getting you leveled out. Usually places will say like the max stay is 5 days, but the average length of stay typically somewhere between 7 and 10 days. And the benefit of that as well, other than like, getting back on meds and restabilized and maybe getting a introduction to group therapy, they often have social workers that try to help get you access to outpatient resources. So like getting you set up with a therapist or finding other groups that you can join, or other activities that can be a support. And so that's where the benefit of that that inpatient, that clinical aspect comes from. So I just wanted to like touch on that, so everyone had kind of like a differentiation. I'm sure it's a little bit different in the UK. I would say like same, but different, right? We've got our short-term clinical, which is the majority of inpatient. There's long-term residential, very hard to get into, very hard to find. And then there's outpatient, which is like going to your regular therapy or seeing a psychiatrist for like medicine adjustments, things like that, or recommendations. And then the plethora of different types of therapists that you can see one-to-one on a regular basis.
Yeah, I believe that it's very similar. I think the main difference would be that you obviously you don't have public healthcare system where it's obviously affordable and free for all in some cases. For people in America, in the UK, we do have it under the NHS, with a massive caveat, in the sense of like, God knows how long it's going to take you to get that service.
I know. When you told me that the first time, because I used to think like, oh yeah, like the UK, they got it down. They have like, public health and access for everyone, but like the quality and the accessibility is partially diminished because of it.
Exactly, particularly in the mental health. Like, I'm not slating the NHS at all. Like, they obviously do wonders for certain people. I've never personally had a very good experience with them, like in my own personal experiences, particularly when it came to my mental health. Like, obviously, the first thing you do, right, like when you start to feel off in whatever way that looks like for you, you start to recognize that something's not quite right with you. is call a doctor. Like that's a natural for in the UK, that's like quite a normal thing. Like you don't understand what's happening, so you're like, okay,
Right.
who can I go to? Okay, well, if you have a family system that's maybe understands those things, great, you'd go to your family system or friends. But if you don't, then you probably go to a doctor. And
Right.
great, thankfully, yes, our doctors are those services are free. And to get an appointment with a doctor is not difficult. However, to then get like the specialist care that you need, that's where it gets a bit more challenging. And I obviously called the doctor and I was like, look, I'm experiencing these symptoms. And at the time, it was like severe panic attacks. This is when I first started going to therapy, but I didn't know what a panic attack was. So like that was,
Yeah.
I didn't know. All I knew that I was doubled over in pain, like chest, like having heart palpitations, like nearly being sick, like crying constantly. Like I didn't know what that meant.
Yeah.
Like I was like, as far as I was concerned, I was like goner, like who knows what was happening to me. But like I could obviously call the doctor and it sounds like, well, it sounds like you're experiencing panic attacks. Like it'd be good to get you like into a assessment for like mental health, blah, blah, blah. And then it's like a completely different service to like the normal kind of health service that you go through if you've got like a physical condition. But if you've
Yeah.
got mental conditions, then you obviously go through the process and the motions with that. And they do like obviously the assessment to see like where you're sitting on a scale. But it's like, I don't know, like I find the process like interesting. I found the process very interesting and very frustrating at the same time because it was like some of the questions that they would ask, it was just like, how are you getting anything from that answer? I can't think of an example now because it was such a long time ago, but I do remember feeling really frustrated by it and being like, well, I don't even know how this is meant to determine how I'm actually
Yeah.
feeling. It felt like compared to obviously when you go for like a physical body assessment, you can do scans, you can do like
Yeah.
actual tests to see like reactions. This was literally like rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 5 of how you're feeling.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, obviously, yeah, like I get it. There's not a lot you can do other than that, but it did feel to me like very weird. I was like, this doesn't feel like I'm being properly assessed. Do you know? I don't know.
Yeah.
Like if that's, I mean, you'll probably know better about how that assessment works and like what the process
Yeah.
is. But for me, I just found that like a bit mind blowing because I was so used to like physical tests.
Yeah. Yeah. No. So, what you're talking about, like that was actually part of when I worked as a behavioral. So for those who don't know, I worked as a behavioral specialist in inpatient psychiatry for 6 years and I fucking loved it. It was great. I left to just do some traveling and then found myself on different paths. But, every day in that unit, when we'd have someone come on, those were the assessments that we did. So we asked a series of questions and it was like on a scale of 1 to 10, how is your mood? Like 10 being super, super depressed, super sad, really struggling, really low, not able to like, are you experiencing things like anhedonia? Like, are you finding joy? But again, this is done conversationally. And so I would just say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how's your mood? 10 being super, super low, like really struggling to find joy in things, maybe thinking you might be depressed. Where are you at on that? And that gives us a sliding scale on a scale of 1 to 10. How anxious are you feeling? How often are you experiencing anxiety? Are you having suicidal thoughts? Are you having self-harm thoughts? Are you having thoughts of harming other people? And then you start to have a conversation and you start to talk about like, so what are some of the things that you're struggling with? A lot of it is thought wise. And mind you, I'm in a clinical aspect. So people are coming in because they need immediate help. So oftentimes they are either they have self-harmed or they're thinking about it or they are thinking about committing suicide and the thoughts are getting too much, or there's thoughts of hurting other people, or there's none of that but they're experiencing more intense auditory visual hallucinations, or they're having some more like kind of psychosomatic symptoms to stuff, as well as and like I'm trying to think of like schizoaffective sort of things. So like people think schizophrenia, oh, there's talking to yourself and there's having delusions and paranoia and things like that. And so we're assessing that in that conversation to get an assessment of where you're at. Now, if you are someone who's coming in because you've had panic attacks, more or less, right? You're just seeing probably a psychiatrist is who you're being evaluated by and having a series of conversations. They're probably going to get a sense of what are your levels are at. Are you at a dangerous enough level that you need to be admitted somewhere for the most average person, no, like you're not a place where you need to be admitted somewhere. So they're going to get an assessment of like, all right, what is your anxiety lying around, or what is there anything that they can pinpoint it? Does it have to do with family stress at home? Does it have to do with work? What does it have to do with? Kind of getting an idea. Is there trauma that you've had growing up? What's that kind of assessment? And then they're just going to give you recommendations. They're either going to prescribe medication to manage as needed. So for example, with a panic attack, you might get something like Xanax, because in the moment, if you don't have the coping skills to calm yourself down, medication is often the next best thing to take the edge off right in that moment, so that you can then be calm enough to function in your daily life. But the idea is that you go to therapy to work on the underlying things that are causing these panic attacks or anxiety attacks. And then based on that conversation, they'll give you recommendations for different types of psychologists or therapists.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
I think the issue I have with that in the UK is that it's done by like the receptionist, for example.
Oh, really?
Like, yeah, it's not done by the person that you're going to be going to see. It's not, I don't know in every case, but in the case that I've been doing this, it wasn't done by like someone that was going to be treating me. It was done by someone just ticking boxes kind of thing. And then you're then based on like your result, and there wasn't, the conversational part isn't there either. It's literally just for outpatient,
like tick, tick.
It's just a tick box. Yeah. And like I remember even asking like on the phone, like, because it's all done over phone as well, it's not done in person. So it's very flawed. It's very, very flawed in my opinion. And it doesn't really get to the real root of anything very quickly, because then you're just palmed off into a box basically saying yes you need it, yes you don't. And the other part of that in the UK is the free bit that I mentioned. So the part of the mental health service that you are able to get, and this is different obviously for different circumstances. So if you're going into inpatient therapy, that would be a different thing, because obviously then you probably are at some higher level of risk. So yes, that is probably also free. But if you're at a low to moderate risk to yourself or to other people, and it's mainly that you're struggling with like low mood or low level or mid-level anxiety, you're basically only given CBT. There's no option through the NHS to get talking therapy or any of the other types of therapy. And so I just felt like for me, and I know a lot of other people that have gone through this process, it's just like you're put in this box, and it's like that doesn't work for everybody. And I understand it's a good starting point for sure. Like
I do think it's a solid starting point. Yeah,
for sure. But I remember at the point of like this time where I was experiencing all these panic attacks, that wasn't what I needed. I just needed to communicate out what was happening for me and get somebody's third party opinion, or just discuss it with somebody that was external to my life. And that wasn't available for me through the NHS. So luckily for me, I had, at the time I was working in full-time employment, and I had private healthcare. So I was able to get it through my private healthcare. But had I not have had that, that wouldn't have happened. And I would have been I was put on a waiting list for 18 weeks for CBT. Wow. 18 weeks, that's 4 months. So it's like 4 months, what's happening in that 4 months time period, who knows? So I was like, no, I need it immediately, and I want talking therapy. So I went private, and I had a whole session, 10 sessions through that. And then later on, when I've gone back to therapy, because I've gone back to therapy probably 4 times now in the past 6 years, for various different reasons. Sometimes it's more from like a preventative measure rather than like trying to fix something in the moment. But I feel like, in the UK, this process is a mess. It doesn't work. As someone that's gone through it, as someone that's seen other people go through it, it does not work. And that was actually the main frustration for me then, thinking, right, this business needs to exist, like Tina needs to exist, was that main frustration with that therapy service in the UK, because you can't get access to the help that you need in a affordable and accessible way.
And like, aside from aside from like the professional support, right? Like knowing, obviously, having a community and things like that, you can know you're not alone, but having someone to professionally reassure you, like, you're okay, there's nothing wrong with you, and this is a safe space. And it's meant to be like a microcosm of practice
Mm.
in therapy, of like how you communicate and practice in therapy is what it's meant to be, a safe place to practice those things and then to learn how to better do it and carry it forward. And so, yes, like therapy is absolutely necessary. Like having access to that is really, really important. But there are a lot of therapeutic practices like CBT, IFS, DBT, other like cognitive reframing, all these things that people can learn on their own and practice on their own. Sometimes it's a little bit harder depending on like how stuck you are where you're
Yeah.
at. Um, but I mean, like when we first met, I think we talked about this. Like, I'm a firm believer that we should be heavily teaching like emotional intelligence skills and like how to properly assess, process, and communicate your thoughts, your feelings, and then how do you bring that forward in behavior. Like, these are skills that can be taught from a really, really young age, and it will set people up better down the road. And so if you can learn it as a kid, you can learn it as an adult. Granted, you have a few more barriers because you've experienced quite a bit in life. But yeah, and I think that's maybe like how we connected, because I think that these things should be accessible to people. Does it
Yeah.
suck that the higher level like support is not as accessible, and that's a systemic issue that like you and I can't change alone? But like with Tina, we can at least provide some of the basic education, some of the basic resources that people can get started with for themselves. And I
Yeah.
also think like at the end of the day, this sucks. And this is a quote that I know was like posted at one point. Trauma and the things that happen to you in life are not your faults, but the healing is your responsibility. And how you choose to move forward with it is your responsibility. And it
Yeah.
requires lead work and action on yourself to do it outside of like
100%.
therapy and support. So I'm with you. That's
100%.
why we started Tina.
Exactly. It is why we started Tina. And it's interesting actually what you just said there, because I had a conversation with a complete stranger the other day about that exact
Okay.
thing. I met this girl on a bus when I was leaving Costa Rica, and I don't even know how we ended up getting into this conversation, but we were talking about like emotional management and like the subjects that should be taught in school. And from what I could understand of this girl, like she grew up with her grandma, like she didn't grow up with like her parents. And from the conversation that we were having, she was talking about like when she went to school, she was treated as if she was being given all of the, like she was put in the same box as somebody that was growing up with their parents, for example.
Mm,
And she just felt like she had a really difficult experience at school, because if schools had taught them how to do like life skills, emotional regulation, emotional management, then she would be in a way better position in her life right now. But she felt like the educational system had failed her because none of those things were taught, and she didn't
yeah.
have like the parental figures in her life to teach her as well. And I
Yes.
feel like the flaw with the educational system is that we're put in this box of like that every kid is the same, and that is just absolutely not the case. And I completely get that they can't cater to every single child, like that would be impossible. However,
Right.
emotional regulation, all of that stuff, like it can't just be assumed that you're going to learn that in your youth from your parents or your caregivers, whoever you're being raised by, because
Yeah.
that's the situation is so different for everybody else. So I feel like if they could put that into the school system in across the world, fucking hell, the world would be such a better place. Like
Such a
the
better
world would be such
place.
a better place.
Yeah. And
It's crazy.
and I feel for this person that you're talking about, like she didn't have parents at all. But if I'm being honest, 80% of the kids, even with parents, their parents they don't know these life skills. They don't know how to emotionally regulate. They don't know how to do any of these things. So it's just perpetuating a pattern of like fucked up expression and fucked up feeling. And
Yeah.
they're not able to cope themselves. So how can they teach their kids to cope? And this is just something that like it just needs to be taught, because like we need to break that somewhere. But
Yeah.
but but with that being said, I'd be curious to we can talk a little bit about more of like our personal experiences with therapy,
Yeah.
because you said you've gone on and off. So like what has therapy, like how did you first get into therapy? I think it was with the panic attacks. Or like, how did you first
Yeah.
get into it and how has it been since?
Yeah, so that was my first experience. So that was in 2018, and I think I talked about it before, but it was our following like a really bad breakup with.
Yeah.
It was a very toxic situation, and like then it just led me onto this whole rabbit hole of like mental health stuff.
Yeah.
So that was my first experience, and I did 10 weeks of talking therapy with a really lovely lady in London. I actually went to the office and I sat down with her, and I had these therapy sessions before I'd go to work, like every Thursday. I remember. And that was an interesting experience because obviously it was in person, and I remember feeling so vulnerable in those sessions because you're sat opposite someone, there's no screen or anything, it's literally just like you're sat opposite someone and you're having to talk about your feelings. And I just remember feeling so embarrassed every time that I would cry because I was just like, why am I crying? Like I just couldn't, I didn't, that therapy wasn't necessarily teaching me how to change the way
No.
that I was. That therapy was just somebody to like get me through that moment in time because I was at a very
Yeah.
critical point.
To,
Um,
I was
but
gonna say just
yeah,
to give you a safe space to express whatever was going on
exactly,
with you. Yeah.
exactly that. And that was super helpful. And I feel like had I not have had that experience, it wouldn't have necessarily led me on to like the journey of stuff that I've had today. So I'm very grateful for that experience. But then obviously you leave that because I only had like 10 weeks of it, and then I actually changed jobs. I would have continued it, but I changed jobs and I didn't have the same benefits, so I didn't have the private healthcare to carry on going. So I could no longer go to that therapy. And then 2 years later, we obviously go into the pandemic, and in the pandemic, naturally, a lot of people's mental health started to slip, and mine definitely did. But not necessarily because we were locked up. Mine was because I had quit my job before we went um, into the pandemic, and then I was starting this business throughout the pandemic, and I just got to a point where I was working too much and like just going through emotions that I didn't really understand and having like all of these new feelings come up. So I was like, right, I need to go back to therapy. But equally, I didn't have the money to go to therapy. So I had to go through the NHS, in which case the only therapy that I was being given was CBT. So that was my first experience with CBT. I did like an 8-week course of CBT, and I learned a lot actually. I learned a lot
I was gonna say,
of
how did
that.
you like it?
Yeah, like at first I was like, this isn't what I want. But, and also this was different because it was just over the phone. I couldn't even see the guy that I was having therapy with. It was just over the phone,
Oh,
which I didn't
okay.
like, honestly.
Yeah.
But it did really help me think about a lot of things differently and consider like where some of these, because that first round we didn't dive deep, it was just trying to get me through the moment. But this second round of CBT was more like, okay, we're going to look at the actual like the root cause of the problem, and we're going to try and reframe
Yeah.
your behaviors around that. Did I do the homework? No.
No.
I
Yeah.
did not.
CBT is hard. If you are in a place where you're not feeling good, having to sit down and like for those who don't know, CBT is literally like labeling your thoughts, labeling your emotions so that you're becoming aware of what's happening and understanding what is your story and what part you play within that story. And then what do you need to do to consciously manage those emotions, to reframe the unhelpful thoughts? Because friendly reminder, guys, thoughts are not truths. They aren't always real. And there's different ways and perspectives of looking at things. But it can be really hard to do, even when you're in a stable place. Like it's really hard to like internally look at yourself and like kind of break shit down and challenge yourself. It's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah,
And
it is
I
really hard.
wouldn't like doing that on the phone either, with like no face
Mm-mm.
to face. I don't think I would have liked that.
Yeah, I didn't like it, and it was like he'd send me an email and be like, "This is what we're working on." I'm like, "Oh well, this is just like so impersonal." But again, NHS, this was the free service. This is what you're getting. Um, Maybe not everyone has that experience, but that was what they gave me in my local area. But anyway, I did that for a period of time, and it did help. It did help. It didn't help in the moment, but it helped later on, because I had every time, the more aware I became of my habits, my behaviors, and like the root cause of the problem, the more I was like, oh, he told me that in this session. And he was like, he told me to do this. And then when I was out of the trenches, like, which was the time that I was going through the CBT, I was then later on able to implement the things that he was asking me to do as homework, which at the time I was like, I'm not doing this. I don't want to journal. I don't want to do gratitude. I don't want to do this stuff. So like that happened later on. And then from the back of that, I thought, do you know what? CBT still isn't quite the type of therapy that I want. I want to do talking face to face with someone, but that's unavailable in the NHS. You can't get that. And I didn't have a lot of money to be going to services like BetterHelp or go to find a therapist. Like, I don't know how much it is in the US. I'm sure it's probably very similar, but you can't really get like a decent therapist for under about £100 an hour.
I think that if you're doing like totally no insurance, you're paying out of pocket, you're paying anywhere from 150 USD to 500 USD an
Exactly.
hour. Like
Which is unaffordable for the majority of British people. Like
people.
that,
Yeah.
that's a
Oh yeah.
luxury. Like that's not something that can be done. And at the time I didn't have a job, I was literally starting a business, so I definitely didn't have that money to just be like throwing on therapy, even though I knew it would be good. But the one thing that good that came out of that CBT was that this one guy, he was local to me, and he was like, do you know what, I know that you want talking therapy, but we can't give that to you. However, I do know that in your borough of London, there is a community counselling program that basically allows you to pay whatever you can afford for counselling sessions. And it's people that are training to be counsellors, basically. That's how they get the cost down. And I think it's a brilliant business model, and I think it should be rolled out globally because it's really good for anybody that cannot afford the full level of therapy service that they need. And I ended up paying, so the scale was you'd sign up and it was still a wait list, but only maybe 5 weeks, not 18 weeks, which it would have been on the NHS. And you could only get it if you lived in a certain postcode in London. Luckily, I lived in that postcode. And you could basically decide to pay anything between £10 and £50 an hour for your session. And I think I went somewhere, most people go somewhere in the middle. So I think I was paying about £25 an hour for the session. And that therapist was in training, but counsellor, she was in training, but she was having, like, you could have someone super experienced or you could have someone that's like just starting out. But luckily mine was quite experienced. She was also like somebody that I really resonated with. Like, she loved travel. Like, we kind of gelled. Like, she was quite into like a lot of the things that I was into. And I think that that's another thing to talk about is it's so important to find the right person, because I know I've got friends that have like knew that they needed to go to therapy and they've tried it out, but they're like, hate therapy. And I'm like, well, I think it's because you don't like your therapist. And I can totally understand like why you would not want to go and speak to someone if you don't feel safe to speak to somebody. So I think that's another thing to bear in mind if you are considering going to therapy. But me and this lady got on really well, and ever since then I've actually got the relationship with her now. She went private after she fully qualified, and now we have a relationship where whenever I need to go, I feel like I need a session, I just text her and I'm like, can we book it in? So since that point, this was in the end of 2021 that I found her through the community counselling services. And since then I've gone back to her maybe 2 or 3 times, like for a period of a month or two, whenever I've been going through something. And most recently it was literally like a couple of weeks ago that I went to her because I've got a lot of stuff going on in my life right now. And I just felt like I needed an outlet that was external to the people in my life to just talk it through. And I knew that she would give me some pointers in the right direction. And that isn't for everybody, but I think if you can find the right person to talk to, or if you can find the right style of therapy for you, I think it can be very helpful. And I know you've had a completely different experience with therapy, because I know you had it when you were very young as well, right?
Yeah. And yeah, so before I jump into that, I would say like I think, right, sometimes it takes a minute to find the right person for you, but you also have to think about it like this. You're going like most people after the first or second session, they're like, no, it's not for me. Like, I don't want to do it. And I think that sometimes you have to give it a bare minimum of 3 to 4 sessions. And then after that, if you're like, it's not feeling right, then it means you need to change either the style of therapy or the therapist themselves. Like, you need to find someone else that you can jive with. Because think about it, you're going into a meeting one-to-one with a stranger you've never met, and now you have to tell your whole life story to and express all of these really uncomfortable emotions that you've never yourself really dealt with in a healthy way. Of course it's going to be uncomfortable, and of course it's going to suck. It's going to be weird the first at least 2 to 3 times that you meet this person. It isn't until like after that and that you like have a little bit of knowing that like some comfort starts to form, at least out of like you're no longer a true cold stranger, like we've been warmed a little bit in this relationship. And then after the fact, if you feel like you're not getting what you need out of it, or it doesn't still feel right, that's when you change it. So like that's a little friendly tidbit, because you have to remember the situation in and of itself is uncomfortable. It's hard. So it's not going to feel nice. And oftentimes I'm sure you know this as well. I often leave therapy feeling worse when I went in for the
Yeah.
hour. I guess, okay, so I guess I'll talk about like my experience with therapy. So actually I never intended to end up in the psych field. That wasn't like, I wasn't as a little girl, like, I want to be a psychologist or a therapist. That was never my intention. I kind of stumbled half-ass backwards into it. Um, my first experience with therapy is that I was court ordered to go to therapy during my parents' divorce, and their divorce lasted for years, and it was nasty and it was horrible. There was like my parents could not, basically a lot of my childhood was listening to each parent bitch about the other, and like that's just kind of what it was. They dragged each other to court constantly. There was a lot of pulling and tugging of rights of who had me, who did what, and they drained each other financially of everything. So my first experience with a therapist, I do remember this as a kid, as was I didn't like it. I didn't think that I was speaking to someone who was there for me. I thought I was speaking to someone who was there to pull information out of me and then to use that in court. I thought it was manipulative. Even as a child, I really didn't like this. It was not comfortable for me. And then so I had like a burr in my boot about therapy. Like, no, why would I go see a therapist? They're not there to help you. They're just to do whatever. And like, that's what my initial understanding was of therapy. And then growing up, my dad had me in custody of me. He was with a woman who had 2 children of her own. And they were never married, but I considered her my stepmom and my step siblings. And so my stepsister, she had a lot of behavioral issues growing up, and she had to go to like a special school to help with behavioral issues. And there's a lot of things happening there. There's a lot of, at the time, I didn't know this, a lot of mental health issues happening overall in the family. But as a kid, I didn't know what was happening was bipolar disorder. Like I didn't know that this was that, oppositional defiance disorder and AODA issues. Like I didn't know any of those things as a kid. I just knew there was stuff happening. And because my stepsister needed extra support, they got a family therapist for us to go and speak with, but it was mainly for her. But then we would have like one-off sessions occasionally with this therapist just to like kind of paint a full picture and make sure everyone was like on the same page and getting like a semblance of support. And he was really nice. I really enjoyed him. And it was like the first experience of like, oh, like I'm talking to an adult like that is asking about me and just engaged in me. And like, yes, but it's for the good of the unit of the family. Right. So that was my next experience with it. And then my next experience after that was, and this was a big one. I was 16 and things were not going really well at home. My dad and this woman had split, and her kids were out of the house. They were pretty much, gone. There's a lot of convolution in there, but things were not going well at home with my dad. It was a very unsafe and unhealthy environment for me to be in. Money issues, abuse issues, all sorts of stuff. And at the time, my high school sweetheart, I had been spending a lot of time at their house. And his mom saw what was happening, like the interactions that was happening with my dad and things like that. And she suggested that maybe I go see a therapist, and like they had a family therapist that they would go to and that she would recommend. And because there were still court issues and financial issues happening with my mom and dad, and at the time I was on my mom's insurance, I didn't want to feed any fuel. This is me at 16. This is what I'm thinking at 16, right? I didn't want to fuel any, fuel the fire of having to be dragged back into court, because now all of a sudden I'm going to therapy and it's showing up on her insurance, and to like see what that, like how that would be. There was a lot of like backhanded games that were played, like to use things against one another. So like, this is what I was thinking about. So my boyfriend's mom took me to meet the therapist, and the therapist was like, look, I explained to her everything that was going on, and she goes, look, I will see you not through insurance. You just have to pay the copay and come once a week or once every other week. Bless her heart, she's a freaking angel, because that's a lot of money that she's losing out on after years and years of building her career and her job and all of that. And she was a super solid support. And at some point I did like try to bring my dad into it, to like into therapy. He wouldn't have any of it. He wouldn't talk to the therapist. But it got to the point, and I knew this, she had said to me, and I understood, if it ever seemed like I was in so much danger that I should no longer be in the house, she would have to report it to Child and Family Services. She goes, if and when it gets to that point, we'll have a conversation about it. And it did get to that point, and we had a conversation. And I didn't want, again, 16-year-old thinking like, I don't want to report my dad to the Department of Child Family Services, even though this is like a really fucked up situation. And we came up with a plan to get me out of the house at 16. Originally, I was thinking about going to move in with my mom for the first time since I was like 6, but she was still hardcore drinking and she was not able to manage herself. And that was also a shit show. And my best friend at the time, I was very lucky. I had people in my life who like helped me out. Her family knew of all the scenarios that was happening at my house. I used to like take showers at their house because like our water would be shut off, or like we wouldn't have heat and stuff like that. And there was a big blowout. Something had happened, and I went to Megan, as 16-year-old girls do. And I was like, I'm like crying, and I was upset. And she told her parents because she didn't know what to do. And so her parents sat me down, and they're like, you can move in with us for the rest of high school, and like you can finish out, and we'll get you just till the end of high school. Cool. And so they helped me out. I mean, granted, they housed me, they fed me, but I tried to give them money as much as I could. I had a job since I was 14, like whole thing. But anyways, that therapist was a huge support. And then I think it wasn't until after college that I then saw another therapist when my dad was really, really sick, and he'd lied about a lot of things. He had end-stage liver failure from drinking. And I started having anxiety attacks. Actually, it was like after I graduated college, right? It's like, oh, I did it. I graduated college. I've got a big girl job. I've got a place that I'm living. I finally feel safe and settled. And all of a sudden I started having anxiety attacks, and my mood was really low. And then of course, another wave of stuff with my dad and everything that was happening with him. And I was like, fuck it, I can't do this. And I went to therapy, and I started seeing a therapist again. And yeah, so it's always been on and off for me, I think, as well. A lot of it was like kind of pushed upon me at some points. And then as an adult, I've chose to go to therapy when I need it, preemptively or even after the fact. And it's helpful. I've done CBT on my own, but that's because I've been when working in the field, I was trained in different areas. And so I knew how to apply it to myself. And I've done like self-journaling CBT. And then I spoke about it with therapists and things. My issue is that I'm little Miss Know-it-all. Well, no, I have really high emotional intelligence, and I don't mean that in a cocky way, but I also then worked in the field. So I have a hard time finding a therapist that like, one, that I can jive with, but two, I need someone who can challenge me, who can like Kelsey, think about like sometimes I do a lot of like thinking through situations, like instead of allowing myself to feel what I need to feel. And I need to be challenged to like stop thinking through things and to allow myself to feel what it is that I need to feel, because that was a survival technique for a very long time. But yeah, so now I don't have insurance. I don't have I lost my last therapist because I lost my insurance, and I was on like the Medicaid. So in the US, what happens is if you have insurance through your job, great. If you don't have a job, and if you're making below a certain income, you get what we would call like our public health insurance. But now with my business, because I've started making more money, I no longer qualify for that, but I don't make enough money to be able to afford private insurance. So
Mm.
I'm in this middle that I don't have insurance and I can't get services. So
Yeah.
go
Yeah,
America.
that's just, oh yeah, it's just a shit show everywhere, really, isn't it? Like you can never really
Yeah.
win and get like what you actually need, which again is why we're kind of doing this this whole thing. But yeah, I guess like it's interesting because there are so many different reasons why people go to therapy, and there are so many
Yeah.
different benefits that come off the back of that. And like you just said, like a big one word that I feel like you said there that stood out to me was like support. It wasn't necessarily like, you know, you wanted to like release emotion or like go there and like talk through it. Probably all those things happened, and yes they did, but at that time in your life it was just because you needed the support. And that was the same as me, like when I was having the panic attacks, it was
Yeah.
because I needed the support. And then later on it was because I knew that something needed to change in my life, so that's obviously why I did CBT. And then after that it was
Yeah.
more like preventative, because I could feel myself like
Yeah.
something's happening. And like I think one of the biggest things, and we should do another episode on this actually, is that when one thing that for me, and you tell me if you feel the same, I'm terrified of feeling the way that I felt before the first time I went to that therapist. Like I'm absolutely terrified of going back to that place because it really was not a good or happy place. So now whenever I slightly see my mental health decline, I panic, and it's like actually a massive fear of mine to go back to that. And like for me,
Yeah.
the minute that I can see like, or not the minute, because sometimes I know that now I've got a lot of
It's
coping mechanisms, and like I can do quite a lot of
yeah.
things to calm myself down. But like for example, more recently, and you know this because we've had so many conversations about it, like more recently my mental health hasn't been that great because there's just been so much change in my life over the past few months, and like so many things happening, so much instability. And it wasn't like, normally if it's like a couple of little bits I'm like, okay, I can deal with it myself. But when it's
Yeah.
everything, this feeling like it's like kind of crumbling around you, that's when I get a bit worried. And then I'm like, okay, therapy straight away, like without even questioning it. I don't even care how much money I've got in my bank account, I have to go, because I just think like prevention is the cure when it comes to mental health. So obviously the minute that I start recognizing that something's wrong, I go straight back. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. Like I think so many people think like, oh, I'll go once and then I'll be done with it, and like no, that's not the case. Like you're probably going to need this in
No,
different forms across your life. And it blows my mind that some people will go their whole life without going to therapy, honestly, because I just think it is like one of the most powerful things you can do. And like, yeah, maybe you won't gel with it, maybe it might not be your vibe, but like I can guarantee you'll learn something from it, and you will do
for
then
sure.
something as a knock-on effect of going to a session that impacts your life in a positive way. So I just feel like, yeah, like I said at the beginning, everybody should benefit from going to therapy at some point in their lives.
Yeah. The analogy that I used to use with my patients when I worked inpatient who like were hesitant about therapy or things like that, but they really needed it. Um, think about your car, right? You have a car, you have to go and tune it up regularly. You have to get your brakes changed, you have to get your oil changed, you have to, I don't know, I'm not a car person, but there's a bunch of stuff that you have to do to cars
Yeah.
on a regular basis. Um, and you do that so that it doesn't break down and then become completely useless to you, where you can't really use it. And you
Exactly.
have this car that if you had taken care of, it would last you for a really long time. The same concept works for us as human beings. It works for our physical health as well as our mental health, right? And if you've never had the coping skills or the education on how to take care of your mental wellness, you got some old oil in those pipes, baby, like that you need to clear out. Because what it is, that what's happening is it's inhibiting you from being able to move forward in your life unencumbered by like bullshit from past experiences or things that were put upon you that were not your faults, right? But like now you've absorbed, and it's giving you different limiting beliefs and different perspectives that are holding you back from going out and achieving what you want to achieve, and taking action and effort, or just simply being kind and gentle with yourself because you are a deserving human being, but you might not believe that because of your past experiences. And so I think, once a year, baby, go and get your oil checked in your brain and see what's up, see
Yeah.
how your heart and your head are feeling. Are they connected? Are they in line? Are you feeling grounded? If not, you can get, the concrete services like CBT, or you could just go to talk therapy to talk things out. And you hit the nail on the head with multiple things. It's one is getting support in the moment because you're really struggling, you're simply surviving. It's to actually actively work on changing patterns of behavior, or it's like a preventative measure. You know that you've got a lot of stress in your life right now and there's a lot of things coming up. Preventatively, you can protect yourself. So yeah, I think those are all really key points. And I think just to maybe we could touch on the benefits of therapy in general is, right, releasing feelings and emotion, getting different perspectives, like the new tools to change your mindset, habits, behaviors, and then just being able to have a soundboard to work through a problem with, which I think people underestimate how powerful it can be. I mean, that's why there's like coaches and things.
Definitely. I think one thing that it's really helpful for, particularly, I feel like we live in a bit of a world where so many people suppress their emotions or don't know how to feel their emotions for various different reasons. I feel like it's changing now in the younger generations, but particularly with like our generation and older, I feel like it's still there's still a stigma around crying. There's still a stigma around feeling sad. There's still a stigma around feeling anxious. And like people won't allow themselves to feel those emotions or express those emotions through in fear of like what people are going to think, or in fear of what of feeling weak, or like not being able to handle it, or if it opens a gate, then what happens, you know? And like
Right.
I think one of the best things that could come out of you going to therapy is that you are allowing yourself a space to feel and release the emotion, because emotion stored is so dangerous. It's so dangerous. I've seen it so many times. I've seen it in myself. I've seen it in so many other people. And when it erupts and you've like held it in for that long, it is so damaging to yourself, to relationships,
Yep.
to everything in your life. And at least if you're going, you shouldn't feel embarrassed about going to speak to a stranger about your emotions, because if you don't feel safe to go and speak to your partner, you don't feel safe to go and speak to your friends, you don't feel safe to go and speak to your family, go into a completely external person who isn't going to judge you, who isn't going to like feel any kind of feeling towards the way that you're feeling. It's the best way that you could possibly release it and like go and just like get everything out that you need to get out, and you're going to feel a million
Yeah.
times better at some point down the road. Maybe not straight away, as we said, sometimes you can leave therapy feeling a bit traumatized by it, but
Yeah.
in the grander scheme of things, in the long run, you're going to feel like you've had a release of feeling and emotion. And I think that's really important. And if you are somebody that like tends to store emotion, or even more dangerous if you don't feel emotion anymore because you've stored it and buried it down for
So
so
deeply.
long,
Yeah.
I'd say that this is a really important, try and figure out a way that you can get it out, if therapy is the right option or not. But yeah, I'd say that that is definitely something, one of the biggest
Yeah.
benefits that I could see would help a lot of people right now.
Oh my God, absolutely. And just to piggyback on what you said about, because we've mentioned it twice, but we just kind of glossed over it. Yes, sometimes going to therapy, you come out of a session feeling like absolute dog shit. And I hate to say it, but that's kind of the point. The point is to go talk about the things you need to talk about, feel the uncomfortable feelings that you need to feel in a safe and supportive environment, and then learn how you deal with those uncomfortable emotions after the fact. That's
Yeah.
that's what therapy is in practice. Like it is a microcosm of doing that in your life at different periods of time in different situations. And so it is uncomfortable, but I can promise you, I mean, right? Like, okay, Sophie and I are two really good examples. We've done a lot of therapy, we've done a lot of self work. I know we both have had really heavy, uncomfortable emotions. We're still here. We're still here. In fact, so much so that we're thriving in life. Granted, she's got some stuff going on with her personally. I've had stuff, especially a lot in the last year. Life can suck, but because we've allowed ourselves to go through the process of feeling what we need to feel and getting support for that and all of that, we are more resilient in the face of the problems that happen on a regular basis. And so
Yeah.
think about it's just building resilience. And that's what's key if you want to have like a thriving life and if you want to achieve the things you want to achieve and not feel like crap. Right. So
yeah,
kind
at the
of
end of the day, life is hard. Life comes with challenges. Life isn't an easy ride all the time. Like, yeah, you might have like really amazing periods, but then you might have also really low periods, and you want to make it as easy for yourself as possible, right? Like, even though I've had I'd say like this is basically like the ride of life, like a little roller coaster. And whenever you're in that down period, if you've gone through one already, and you know that you've gone through it, you're going to be 10 times stronger to get to the next one, like get through the next one and then get through the next one. And like, it's a given that shit happens in life. Like, it is that does happen, but it's how you then process it and manage it. And sometimes in the moment, it's not easy. You're not going to have your finest moments for sure, but like after it, or like as you start to see a little glimmer of light, you then will recognize like that you can put in practice all the things that you've learned from the therapy, or like go to therapy, or do all of the things that we're obviously going to like recommend and suggest through the resources that we provide through Tina. But yeah, I feel like it's so important to recognize that one big thing is that, yeah, you might come out of therapy feeling more stressed, but in the long run it's going to be really beneficial for you. And yeah, it's a tool that you can kind of go back to as and when you need it. Don't feel like it has to be, you have to have it all the time, or like you can only go once and never go again. Like, it's one of those things that if you want it, go and get it, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's a really great segue for to go and get it. Specifically how you guys can start your journey of getting into therapy. I know I have some recommendations. Sophie has some recommendations. I just want to give the caveat. I'm US based, she's UK based, like with our knowledge. So know that like it might be a little bit different and we can't give super explicit to you in your area, but there are a lot of resources out there. I don't know if you wanted to start, Sophie, with how you'd recommend people start getting into finding therapy for themselves or the right
Yeah,
therapist.
I think a lot of what we've said, obviously, it is going to depend on, if you're in the UK, depend on like what available access you have to like financial support to get
Right.
your therapy. Because if you want CBT, then obviously the most easy and affordable way would be to go through the NHS and try and see if you can get onto the wait list. So obviously, the earlier you can get on the wait list, the easier it's going to be for you to get that, because there will be a waiting time. But you will be able to get access to a series of cognitive behavioural sessions. But that, I would suggest, is more so if you already know what you're already sensing that something's wrong and you want to work through it actively, not necessarily if you just want the support of like talking therapy. If you want the support of talking therapy, I know that there's some really amazing local community counselling sessions, like I mentioned earlier. So it would be a case of maybe either going to the NHS and seeing if they can recommend anyone in the local area that can give you community counselling, which would be potentially pay as you feel. And then there's also a new service that's opened up to kind of make therapy a bit more accessible in the UK, called the Self Space, and they are doing like pop-up locations all around like major cities where people can just like walk in and get access to therapy on demand, which is a really great way to access it. And alternatively, if you do have private healthcare, you should also be able to get a list of therapists on through your private healthcare provider, and contact them and reach out to them to see what their availability is. And equally, just Google like your local therapy services if that's something that you want to go to. Obviously, there will be a cost attached, unfortunately, and there's not that many free options to get talk therapy in the UK. But obviously, you can try your local doctors and see if that would help for you. And then I think globally, there's BetterHelp now as well, and like some other online therapy services. If you really don't have any money to spend on therapy, and you know that you need someone to talk to, there's also charities like the Samaritans, which you can call a helpline and talk to somebody that is going to be there to listen. They might not necessarily have the tools or the resources to be able to give you advice and talk you through some of the things that a therapist would, but they will definitely be an ear to listen to whatever is going on for you.
Yeah. Perfect. In terms of like US base, I would say so a lot of what she said, you can, if you do have insurance, you can go through just your general physician, your GP, general physician, or you can go to your general physician can recommend you to a psychiatrist, or they can potentially, they most likely will recommend you to a psychiatrist, and then the psychiatrist will recommend you to therapists and different kind of like therapeutic resources that you can have. That's even with like Medicaid and things like that. If you're trying to do the research on your own, one of my favorite tools is Psychology Today, psychologytoday.com. They have actually a directory where you can go in, you can put in what your insurance is. You can put in, I've never tried it without insurance, so you could probably try that. You could put in your zip code. You could put in what type of therapist you're, like the age range, male, female, if you know specifics of I want IFS or CBT or DBT or whatever, trauma or addiction or whatever it is that you want, you can put in those filters as well, and it will show who's available in your area. And then you can make phone calls to see, do they have availability? Are they taking any new people? And to get your name on the books with them. So psychologytoday.com has a directory. That's fantastic. I've used that for myself. I've used it for people in my community. And then there's also, like Sophie said, there's local community councils. It's a little bit different, I think, how you access it in the US. And so you might just have to do some digging via Google because it's very different from like county to county. And then, as she said, accessibility online is BetterHelp. And then I would say if you really like have no other options, you're feeling in a bad spot, you don't have the ability to like research anything or find anything, you can always call the national, it's the crisis lifeline in the US, and it's 988. You can also, I believe, text the number as well. So if you're just like in a place where you don't feel like you can do searching for things on your own and you do need support, remember 988 for the US. That's a really good option. But yeah, I think there's resources out there. We're hoping with Tina, as we continue to build it, to bring it all together in one space for you, because the idea is, right, you're already not feeling mentally well. You're struggling to do your daily stuff and to keep it together emotionally. It's hard to like go online and dig and search and find resources and find what can help and what's the best support for you. And so our goal with Tina is to bring that all into one space, to have one marketplace that has not only products and tools, but, you know, services. At some point, we hope to bring in people who can provide services on so many different tiers and levels, or to have even clear resources for you to be able to find the people in your area. So we'll, stay tuned. We'll be bringing that to you. But anything else you want to add, Sophie?
No, I think we've covered a lot there, and I think, like you said, Cassie's saying, we want to be a resource for you. Like that's our goal. We want to help you, empower you to take your mental well-being into your own hands. It doesn't need to just come from therapy. So although that's a route that we really highly recommend, and we can totally say that there are benefits to going to therapy, you can do a lot of the work yourself. And that's what our aim is, to provide you with the tools to do so. So hopefully we've given you some insight into whether therapy may or may not be right for you. If you have been considering doing it, please go. And then if otherwise, thank you for listening to our episode today. If this resonated with you, be sure to give us a like, and we would love to hear your feedback in the comments about what topics you'd like to hear more about. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on socials, and join the community at timeisnothealer.com. All the details can be found in the episode description below. And remember, you hold the power to heal. Until next time, you've got this.